Gregory slammed his hand on the table, his face red with rage. "You are nothing but uneducated trash," he screamed across the dining room. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I looked directly into his eyes, then at Susan, Caleb, and Jasmine, who sat smirking. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I chose a heavy, calculating silence, turned on my heel, and walked out. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I drove back to my apartment. The silence in the car wasn't lonely, it was liberating. The streetlights flashed across the windshield, illuminating the road ahead, completely clear of the suffocating expectations I had left behind in that dining room. As I walked through my front door, I didn't collapse onto the couch. I didn't break down into tears or scream into a pillow. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I took off my coat, poured myself a glass of iced water, and sat at my kitchen island. I opened my laptop and started clicking. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. Now, I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. It was time to cancel. First on the agenda were the secondary credit cards. Click, blocked. I watched the screen confirm that the platinum cards I had issued to them were now useless pieces of plastic. Next was Caleb's monthly allowance for his so-called business expenses. He claimed he was an entrepreneur, but his only successful venture was spending my money. Click, canceled. Then came Jasmine's access to the emergency trust fund I had set up when she wanted to buy a house in a gated community. Click, frozen. I moved methodically through the entire financial architecture of my family. Susan's luxury car lease was registered under my corporate account. I instructed my legal team to issue a formal notice of lease termination to the dealership, citing a breach of terms, effectively grounding the vehicle. Gregory's prestigious country club membership, a status symbol he flaunted constantly, was linked directly to my corporate account. Revoked. They weren't just losing a daughter and a sister tonight. They were losing their primary financial pillar. I watched the status bars change from active to terminated, each click severing a tie I had maintained out of some misguided sense of obligation. My pulse was incredibly steady. I didn't feel a single drop of sadness, only the cold, mechanical efficiency of an executive auditing a failing division. They had called me uneducated trash, yet they had happily lived off the logistics technology empire I had built from the ground up over the past 6 years. I contacted my private banker to freeze all outgoing transactions on joint accounts and initiated a formal separation of assets, redirecting the balances into my sole-managed trust. I wiped my name off their utility bills, their insurance policies, and their investment portfolios. The process was sterile, digital, and beautifully definitive. There was no argument, no bargaining, and no room for negotiation. Over the next few hours, I systematically dismantled my presence in their lives. By morning, the extraction was complete. The money that had funded their arrogance was safely locked away behind encryption protocols they could never bypass. I closed the laptop. The transaction was over. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street. When you remove a tumor, you don't mourn the loss of the cells. You simply monitor the healing process. Tomorrow, the direct debits would bounce, and they would realize exactly who had been underwriting their arrogance. For years, I had quietly played the role of the savior. It started small, almost imperceptibly, paying off the remainder of their mortgage when Gregory's consulting business took a sudden hit. Then came Caleb's exorbitant private university tuition, which Susan tearfully begged me to cover so he wouldn't start his adult life burdened by debt. Next was Jasmine's boutique opening, a vanity project that bled money from day one, entirely subsidized by my logistics company's profits. I had stepped in every single time. I paid, I fixed, I subsidized, and in return, they treated me like a burdensome employee. They convinced themselves that their luxurious lifestyle was a direct result of their own superiority. They suffered from the illusion of power, of an empty wallet. The psychological reality of their situation was simple. Their status was just a rented facade, paid for by my money, and without it, they had no intrinsic value to stand on. They confused having material wealth with actually being people of value. Because they didn't earn the money they flaunted, they believed they were simply entitled to it by divine right. They looked down on my 12-hour workdays and my calloused hands, mocking the very work ethic that kept their refrigerators stocked with organic produce and their driveways filled with European cars. Gregory loved to boast about his financial acumen at dinner parties, swirling his expensive scotch and conveniently omitting that his portfolio was entirely propped up by my monthly deposits. Susan constantly bragged about her independent entrepreneurial children, pointing proudly to Jasmine's failing boutique while completely ignoring the logistics empire I had built. They had rewritten our family history to erase my contributions, because acknowledging my financial success would mean acknowledging their own utter failure. I had allowed them to live in this delusion for far too long. I had mistakenly thought that funding their lives would eventually buy their respect. But love from a toxic family isn't a bond. It's a contract with hidden fees, predatory interest rates, and absolutely no return on investment. The moment Gregory screamed at me in that dining room, calling me trash in front of the people whose lives I funded, the illusion shattered permanently. I saw clearly that their superiority complex was built entirely on the fragile foundation of my bank account. They thought they held all the power because they held the traditional titles of father, mother, brother, and sister. But family titles do not pay the bills, nor do they guarantee loyalty when respect is completely absent. They were about to learn a brutal lesson in economics. When you build your entire identity on rented ground, the eviction notice is devastating. I poured myself another glass of water and watched the city lights flicker outside my apartment window. The myth of their independence was unraveling by the second. They had spent their entire lives pretending they were titans of industry, while I quietly swept the floors and paid the rent. They had mistaken my generosity for weakness, my silence for submission. But in the world of business, the silent partner always holds the true power. I was simply executing a hostile takeover of my own life, reclaiming the equity I had foolishly invested in people who viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be depleted. The fallout began exactly at 9 o'clock the next morning. My phone screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. There were no apologies. There were no moments of self-reflection or attempts at reconciliation. There was only pure, unadulterated escalation. Caleb was the first to strike, launching a very public performance of toxicity on his social media profiles. He posted a long, rambling paragraph about toxic family members who let money go to their heads, claiming I had abandoned the family out of sheer greed and selfishness. Jasmine quickly shared it, adding her own dramatic commentary about how heartbreaking it was to see her sister choose money over blood. Then came the phone calls. My phone vibrated endlessly on my desk, a relentless digital drumbeat. I didn't silence it. I sat back in my office chair and watched the screen flash with Gregory's name, then Susan's, then Caleb's. When I finally answered a call from Gregory, I didn't say a word. I just listened to the storm. "You listen to me, young lady," he barked, his voice dripping with forced authority and barely concealed panic. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, cutting off the credit cards, but you will fix it immediately. You do not disrespect your parents this way." There was absolutely no remorse in his tone. They weren't shocked by the cruel things they had done to me. They were shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. "You have until noon to restore the accounts," Susan shrieked, citing Jasmine's outstanding vendor payments as if their financial incompetence was my responsibility. It was a predictable attempt to leverage guilt, but the strategy was obsolete. It was a fascinating case study in emotional manipulation. They were trying to leverage their traditional parental authority to force me back into submission. They truly believed that if they yelled loud enough, if they publicly shamed me on the internet, and if they demanded compliance, I would crumble and open my wallet to buy back their affection. I ended the call without speaking a single syllable. I didn't feel the need to defend myself or explain my actions. Defending yourself implies you are on trial, and I had already dismissed the judge, the jury, and the entire courtroom. Let Caleb and Jasmine post their performative outrage for their meager online following. Let Gregory and Susan scream into the void until their throats were raw. Their hostility was just the desperate thrashing of a failing business model, realizing its primary funding had been permanently cut. I took careful screenshots of Caleb and Jasmine's defamatory posts and calmly forwarded them to my legal team. This wasn't just a petty family dispute anymore. It was an asset liquidation, and I was calling in the auditors. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and reviewed my morning agenda. The toxicity they spewed no longer had any power over me. It was simply data, evidence of their instability, which I would use to fortify the walls I was building around my newly reclaimed life. I transitioned smoothly from a position of silence to a full-scale strategic siege. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I contacted my lead corporate attorney, requesting a comprehensive review of every financial tie linking me to Gregory, Susan, Caleb, and Jasmine. Over the past 6 years, I hadn't just given them gifts. I had formally structured several massive capital transfers as commercial business loans to offset my company's tax liabilities. Gregory had eagerly signed the promissory notes at the time, confidently assuming I would never have the audacity to enforce them. He assumed wrong. I instructed my legal team to issue formal notices of default and to initiate immediate debt collection on all outstanding loans. Within 48 hours, the legal couriers began making their deliveries across the city. The first certified notice hit Jasmine's boutique, demanding immediate repayment of the $85,000 I had fronted for her initial inventory, exactly as stipulated in our commercial contract. The second notice was delivered directly to Gregory's office, outlining the default on the $200,000 loan that had miraculously saved his consulting firm from bankruptcy 3 years ago. My lawyer was ruthless, methodical, and precise. He filed the paperwork to freeze the commercial lease on Jasmine's store, which my logistics company officially owned. He initiated the repossession protocol for Susan's luxury SUV, citing a breach of the lease terms. I was systematically dismantling the entire economic infrastructure I had built beneath them. The panic on their end was immediate, chaotic, and palpable. The angry, defamatory social media posts abruptly stopped, replaced by a flood of frantic, pleading voicemails left on my executive assistant's phone. Gregory tried to physically bypass security at my corporate headquarters, demanding a face-to-face meeting, only to be politely but firmly informed by the guards that he was no longer an authorized visitor. They had wanted to treat me like uneducated trash. Now, they were dealing strictly with the chief executive officer. I reviewed the legal briefs with clinical detachment. Every signature, every contract, and every financial footprint was undeniable. They had built their lavish, arrogant lives on a foundation of my capital, and I was pulling out the structural supports one by one. I completely refused to engage in their desperate attempts to negotiate a settlement. I communicated exclusively through registered mail and my legal counsel. The toxic family dynamic had been permanently restructured into a straightforward creditor and debtor relationship. They had spent 28 years taking my presence and my resources for granted, assuming the well of my generosity would never run dry. They were currently finding out exactly how unforgiving the desert could be when the oasis is closed. I signed the final authorization documents to proceed with the asset seizures. My pen glided across the paper, sealing their financial fate. The siege was flawless, executing a perfect extraction of my worth from their parasite ecosystem. I instructed my legal department that there would be zero leniency. If they missed a payment deadline by even a single minute, we would move to seize their remaining personal assets. My empathy had been entirely liquidated. All that remained was a meticulously maintained ledger, and their balance was currently deep in the red. While meticulously auditing the family's financial history to ensure a clean and permanent break, my legal team uncovered an anomaly that halted everything. It started as a minor, seemingly clerical discrepancy in the property records of my late grandmother's estate. She had passed away 4 years ago, leaving behind a modest trust that was explicitly supposed to be divided equally among her grandchildren. I had never seen a single dime of it, foolishly assuming Gregory had managed the funds according to her final wishes. I instructed my forensic accountants to dig much deeper into the probate files. What they found wasn't just unethical or morally bankrupt. It was a felony. Gregory had submitted a formal waiver of inheritance to the probate court, a document supposedly signed by me, completely relinquishing my legal rights to my portion of the trust. He had then covertly funneled that exact sum of money directly into Caleb's private university fund and Susan's offshore investment portfolio. I sat at my desk and stared at the digital copy of the document glowing on my monitor. The signature on the bottom line wasn't mine. It was a clumsy, desperate, and unmistakable forgery. Gregory had somehow bribed a compromised notary to authenticate the forged waiver, effectively bypassing the court's standard verification process. The realization hit me not with a sudden wave of sorrow or betrayal, but with the cold, hard weight of absolute finality. This was the unforgivable crime. It wasn't just about the stolen money. It was about the undeniable fact that Gregory had actively stolen from my grandmother's legacy and falsified my identity to orchestrate the theft. Any microscopic, lingering doubt I might have harbored, any tiny, irrational voice whispering that maybe I was being too harsh on my own flesh and blood, was silenced instantly and forever. This was a criminal twist that severed the very last cord of empathy I possessed. I immediately forwarded the forged documents to my lead attorney with a single, uncompromising directive: do not hold back. My lawyer immediately contacted the district attorney's office and the probate court judge. We filed formal, ironclad charges for criminal fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The civil litigation I had orchestrated had uncovered evidence that triggered a mandatory referral to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. There would be no more frantic voicemails, no more attempts to use parental guilt, and no more family interventions. Gregory was now looking at substantial potential jail time, and Susan, Caleb, and Jasmine were officially listed as the beneficiaries of stolen assets. The game was entirely over. They had crossed a definitive boundary from toxic family dynamics into hard, undeniable criminality. I sat in the quiet isolation of my office, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I had spent years trying to earn the love of criminals who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, manipulated, and stolen from. The theft of my grandmother's trust wasn't a desperate mistake. It was a calculated, malicious operation. Now, the audit was fully complete, the damning evidence was filed with the authorities, and justice was taking its natural, unyielding course. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The invisible chains of familial duty had been shattered by their own greed. I picked up my phone and authorized my legal team to cooperate fully with law enforcement. My accounting was done, and it was time for the state to collect its dues. The end didn't happen in a sterile courtroom or across a mahogany mediation table. It happened in the gleaming marble lobby of my corporate headquarters. 2 weeks after the formal fraud charges were filed with the district attorney, the financial, social, and reputational ruin of my family was absolute. Jasmine's boutique had been officially shuttered, its windows covered in brown paper. Susan's luxury car had been repossessed from their driveway in broad daylight. Gregory's consulting firm was entirely bankrupt, and his personal assets were frozen by the state pending the ongoing criminal investigation. Security alerted me immediately, requesting instructions. I didn't want them anywhere near my office, but I needed them to see the consequences of their actions. I ordered security to escort them to a secure conference room on the ground floor, under strict observation. I stepped into the conference room and watched them stand near the table, looking like desperate, broken people who had finally hit rock bottom. Gregory looked remarkably aged. His typically confident, arrogant posture completely collapsed. Susan was weeping openly, clutching a tissue. Caleb and Jasmine stared at the floor, absolutely refusing to meet my eyes. Maya, Gregory stepped forward, his voice cracking with a pathetic vulnerability I had never heard before. Please, the bank is foreclosing on the house tomorrow. The lawyers, the police. You have to stop this. We are your family. You can't just throw us away like this. I'm your father. You lost the right to use that word the exact moment you forged my signature to steal my grandmother's money, I said. My voice was incredibly steady, echoing coldly across the marble lobby. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. True power speaks softly. I didn't come down here to negotiate a truce. I came down here to give you my final terms. Susan reached out a trembling hand, her face mascara-stained and desperate. We are so sorry, Maya. We made terrible mistakes. We were under so much financial pressure, we panicked. We'll do anything to make it right. Just tell us what to do. You don't want to make it right, I replied, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes with absolute zero sympathy. You just want the consequences to stop. You want the comfortable illusion back. But consequences are the fixed price of your actions. The commercial loans are in permanent default. The criminal fraud charges will proceed to trial. You will pay back every single cent you stole from my grandmother's trust, or you will face the legal system. My office, my finances, and my life are permanently closed to you. There is no appeal process. I turned to the chief of security standing nearby, who had been quietly observing the exchange. These 4 individuals are legally barred from the premises. Revoke any legacy access codes. If they ever return, notify the police immediately and have them served with a formal restraining order for criminal trespassing. I didn't wait to see their reactions. I didn't wait for Caleb to make another excuse or for Jasmine to cry. I turned around, walked back into the elevator, and pressed the button for my floor. The stainless steel doors slid shut, permanently severing my view of them. I walked back into my office, poured myself a cup of tea, and stood by the massive window, looking out over the streets below. The empire I had built was safe. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It means accepting that the past cannot be changed and refusing to let it control your future. I had spent my entire life trying to buy a seat at a table that was actively rotting beneath me. To anyone listening who feels like the outsider in their own home, this is my letter to those who always feel on the edge. I know the unique, quiet agony of sitting at a table with people who share your blood but do not share your heart. You spend your life shrinking, hoping that if you take up less space, they might finally have room to love you. You endure the subtle dismissals, the overt insults, and the constant feeling that you are a guest who has overstayed their welcome. You pour your time, your money, and your soul into a bottomless pit, praying that one day they will look at you with pride instead of disdain. But you must understand that your worth is not defined by their inability to see it. Walking away from a toxic family is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. It takes unimaginable courage to look at the people who were supposed to protect you and realize that you must protect yourself from them. They will call you selfish, they will call you ungrateful, but you are simply reclaiming the power they stole from you. You are auditing a life that belongs entirely to you. You do not owe your success to people who mocked your struggle. You do not owe your wealth to people who view you as a walking bank account. And you certainly do not owe your loyalty to criminals who forge your name to steal your legacy. The balance sheet of my life was finally clear, and I was stepping into a future unburdened by their toxicity. Your silence isn't a weakness, it's preparation for freedom. Have you ever reached a point where you realize that keeping the peace was costing you your own soul? Tell me in the comments, I read them all.